Centuries ago, long before the modern struggles of identity and liberation, Africa stood at a crossroads of thought. The continent, rich in traditions and wisdom, faced an existential crisis as colonial powers reshaped its lands, languages, and philosophies. In the great kingdoms of the Sahel, in the bustling trade cities of the Swahili coast, and in the intellectual centers of Timbuktu and Ife, a silent war was waged, not with weapons, but with ideas. The question that haunted generations was this: what does it mean to be African in a world that seeks to erase our identity? Before the intrusion of colonial forces, Africa had its own systems of existential thought. The griots of Malaya passed down wisdom through song, the Dogon people spoke of the mysteries of the cosmos, and elders across the continent pondered the balance of life and death. In ancient Africa, knowledge was not just written, it was lived. Philosophers did not sit in ivory towers, but among their people. The Akan concept of Sankofa taught that to move forward, one must look back. The Yoruba belief in Ori emphasized self-destiny and the journey of the soul. But these ideas would soon be challenged by a force that sought to redefine Africa's existence. The arrival of European missionaries and colonizers in the 16th century introduced a new way of thinking, one that dismissed African knowledge and sought to replace it with Western ideologies. African languages were banned in schools, traditions were demonized, and a new identity was forced upon the people. The colonizers did not just take land, they took minds. They told Africans that their wisdom was primitive, their languages inadequate, and their spirituality inferior. The teachings of Descartes, Kant, and Hegel were imposed, while African existential thought was erased from the history books. But resistance brewed in the hearts of those who refused to be erased. By the 19th century, Africa's intellectual resistance had begun. Across the continent, a new generation of thinkers sought to reclaim African thought and merge it with modern ideas. Some studied in European universities, but never forgot their roots. They spoke many languages, French, English, Arabic, but in their hearts they were African first. Their minds, sharpened by the knowledge of both worlds, began to form a new movement. They asked, what does it mean to be African? And how do we define ourselves in a world that seeks to define us? One of the first great intellectual warriors was Leopold Senghor. As a poet, philosopher, and future leader, he introduced the concept of negritude, a philosophy that celebrated African heritage and rejected colonial dehumanization. Senghor declared that Africa's strength was in its culture, its emotion, its rhythm. He refused to accept the colonial lie that African civilization was lesser. To Senghor, Africa's soul was its greatest weapon, and he wielded poetry like a sword. But Senghor was not alone. Another voice, more radical and uncompromising, emerged: Frantz Fanon. A man who had seen the brutality of colonization firsthand, he believed that only complete revolution could free Africa from its chains. Fanon did not believe in compromise. He saw colonization as a sickness, a psychological war that turned Africans into shadows of themselves. His words were not gentle, they were fire. Each generation, he wrote, must discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. And for him, that mission was revolution. While Senghor believed in reclaiming African identity through culture, Fanon saw no future without rebellion. This clash of ideas defined the struggle of African existentialism. Should Africa find itself through poetry, music, and history? Or should it burn down the remnants of colonial rule and build something new? This question divided African leaders, intellectuals, and revolutionaries. But as independence dawned, reality demanded an answer. By the mid-20th century, African nations were winning their freedom. But independence did not mean liberation. Many African countries remained trapped, economically, politically, and philosophically. The colonial powers had left, but their shadows remained. African leaders struggled to define their nations. Was freedom simply political, or was it a deeper transformation of identity? The ghosts of Fanon and Senghor lingered, asking, what does it truly mean to be free? Today, Africa still battles with these questions. The struggle is no longer against colonial armies, but against economic dependency, cultural erasure, and the pressures of globalization. In the 21st century, Africa's greatest war is the war for its soul. Who defines the African identity? Africans themselves, or those who still hold economic and political power? The battle is no longer fought with chains, but with education, technology, and art. Across Africa, young thinkers, activists, and artists are reigniting the existential debate. Some embrace Senghor's cultural revival, others follow Fanon's revolutionary vision. From the music of Burna Boy to the films of Nollywood, from the protests against neo-colonialism to the rise of African philosophy in universities, the fight continues. But one question remains: will Africa finally define itself on its own terms?